So, hi everyone. I'm here with James O'Hare today. He's the MD of Link UK and then the business communications or CPaaS space. James, thanks very much for joining me. Great to chat with you.
Good afternoon, Chris.
So I know we were chatting a little bit before, and very much focused on how do you engage customers. We've all been in this like remote digital kind of environment. I mean, how are you sort of seeing that environment change, sort of particularly post, I suppose, the pandemic and the lockdowns we've had in terms of like the current environment?
Yeah, I think the way that we're seeing customer communication change, I think, is rising expectations from
Mm,
consumers. One of the conversation topics we're going to have kind of later on today is around the attention economy, and I think that's a big driver in
mm,
consumer expectations. In that, no longer can brands expect to communicate with consumers in the same way they might have done, prior to the pandemic or
mm,
even 4 or 5 years ago. In that the availability of digital communication is just on is increasing exponentially. The number of
mm,
channels, the number of apps that you've got on your phone that deal with messaging, and also as well the way that you speak with your friends and family naturally is within in the messaging space.
mm.
I think I spend more time messaging my brother and my sister and my father than I do actually speaking to them on the phone, and I think that has definitely changed in the last 3 or 4 years. And I think post pandemic, I think people are really trying to people expect for their services to be provided them in the time that they want them.
Mm. I mean, it does feel like through the pandemic we sort of moved away from, I mean, like 10 years ago, I mean, we were very much more sort of like using the phone to try and call people, and now we've just all moved to like uh, messaging. I mean, even WhatsApp during the pandemic with all the memes that came out. I mean, like
Mm.
everyone who was everyone was on WhatsApp and WhatsApp groups and those kind of things. It feels like we've moved to this much more sort of like digital interaction rather than voice interaction.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a very famous stat out there, and I don't know if it was one of those statistics that's completely made up, but it's certainly stuck with me. In that, I think 18 to 24-year-olds would sooner go to the
Mm.
dentist than make a phone call.
Yeah.
And I think I've got a 16 and a 14-year-old, and I don't think I've received a telephone call from them, in the past 2 years.
Yeah.
I've looked at my phone and actually checked the incoming and outgoing logs. They've never phoned me. They've always messaged me, and I think that's where what's really interesting for brands is that, and especially organisations that have large contact centres, how do you deal with a particular part of the demographic, demographic society that would sooner not be on the phone to you? So, what kind of
Yeah.
customer journey are you going to design to cater for that particular part of society?
Yeah, I mean, there's trends definitely in other markets around which you see this in terms of like voice notes. Do you see stuff around voice notes rather than the text piece? I mean, is that almost like a bit of a halfway house between one and the next?
Um, from a business communications perspective, I don't think we're there yet with voice notes. I think
Hmm.
I certainly was in the industry for a few years ago, where deploying recording and recorded voice broadcast was something which was used. I remember being part of a business during the pandemic where um, a very famous footballer, Jamie Vardy, actually
Hmm.
recorded an outgoing voice broadcast and sent it to
Hmm.
their sort of list of Leicester fans. And I think it was
Yeah.
when football was cancelled at the time, so it was like, please don't cancel your season tickets, or I can't remember the actual, I can't
Yeah.
remember the actual sort of complete content, but that was certainly something that seemed to be sort of resonate during that particular time. But ever since, just thinking about the last year since I've started at Link Mobility back in March, is that the voice side of things has not necessarily been something that we've seen a huge demand for. I think what we have seen
Hmm.
huge demand for is self-serve technology. Allow your consumers to self-serve their issue where possible, and then a
Hmm.
really elegant handoff to an agent when that particular interaction becomes a bit too complicated.
Yeah, and I know you spend quite a lot of time sort of like looking at, I suppose, marketing or customer care and those kind of things. I mean, there's the same kind of challenges that we have in in the collection space as an example, which is really around how do you get customer engagement? How do you get people to
Mm.
pay attention to your message because you've got an important message, whatever it is you want them to do to listen to you? I mean, what are some of the themes you sort of picked up from your customers in terms of trying to get people to engage with you and your brand? Um,
Well, I think one of the major aspects to the, the the challenge that brands are facing is that it's getting harder to engage customers.
mm,
It's getting much harder because the levels of attention, and this is perhaps a good segue into talking about the
Indeed.
attention economy. This is a
Mm,
phrase that was quite trendy 2 or 3 years before the pandemic, and it was this idea that because we are bombarded with messages each and every day. I think a study by Harvard, I think, showed it was like 6,000 to 8,000 interactions, 6,000 to 8,000 messages per day that we are seeing as individual consumers. And then when you have on top of that the rise of micro content, so the
mm,
268 characters I think it is for Twitter, the TikTok videos, Instagram story, where you're actually only engaging with the content for only a matter of seconds. And so
mm,
um, before you then move on, and I think I was at a conference in July where somebody said what we're trying to do as a business is create thumb stopping moments. Because if you think about
mm,
the scrolling sort of mantra that is on your mobile phone these days, to be able to gain someone's attention, you've got to stop them scrolling away from your particular piece of content.
yeah.
Um, and so what we're seeing marketers and also through customer care and also in the financial services industry is that you've got to try and create engaging content that is going to stop them from
Mm,
scrolling on, stop them from moving on, and you've got to do it quickly because within seconds they've moved on. We
mm,
had again another it was the same conference back in July. It was a worldwide FMCG brand. They had
mm,
carried out a particular campaign and they'd been able to use the analytics to measure the amount of time that their
mm,
consumers was interacting with their content. And what they
mm,
found was that TV adverts, had less than 8 seconds of attention. Then when you look at Facebook ads, it was less than 4 seconds. And an online banner ad, which gets a huge amount of investment from brands across the world, online banners, the kind of things that
mm,
you see on websites, third-party cookies, where you go on to my son, borrows my phone and he's hugely into golf at the minute. So I now,
yeah.
whenever I visit any website, it's just serving me adverts for golf gear.
Yeah.
Because of that, that gets less than 1 second of attention. And so, how do all organizations, how do they create content that engages with that particular person, engage with those customers, and does it really quickly?
And I suppose there's almost like this arms race that goes up with sort of
Mm,
those banner ads, and so like how do you get more attention versus other? You used to see that in TV advertising, didn't you? In terms of like it was, and you get these really innovative kind of engaging kind of content to do it. But you're saying there's a different way of doing it rather than using traditional methods. But I think it was like using like mobile methods. I mean, like the mobile phone. I mean, it's transformed communications just in terms of like, I mean, just having this thing, always with you and on your, I mean, just you can do everything through it, right?
mm.
So you're saying like creating rich, engaging content through that is effective? Because I think that the engagement piece is kind of fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. What we're seeing organizations when they're seeing really successful campaigns is when they've been able to
Mm,
have, I think, mimicking the way that people interact with their friends and family. If you
mm,
think about the type of thing you might be arranging to go on a night out on a Friday night, the type of interaction you would tend to have, you would share interesting, and
mm,
amusing anecdotes. You might have a quick back and forth. You might then share a location. That sort of journey, if you were to really look at that with a CX, customer experience, in mind, if you were to look at that, you would actually see a customer journey that could be replicated for businesses. And I think
mm,
using the mobile phone, using mobile messaging applications, whether that's just standard SMS applications, or whether that could be WhatsApp, it could be Google Messages, that would allow you then to create an engaging experience that is
mm,
two-way. It's a conversational experience. That's where we're seeing sort of brands get some amazing results. And we showed an insurance company, hardly
mm,
the most sort of creative of industries, shall we say, or exciting of industries, they managed to use the Google Messages to create a brand experience, engage with rich imagery, engage with a conversational flow to that interaction, and it was an insurance company based in France, and they were able to encourage their customers to actually explore their other options within their insurance world. So they could go for a single car versus a multi-car policy. They could go for home
Mm.
insurance versus car insurance, and they actually got 2 or 3 minutes of average engagement per consumer. And when I said earlier on, we're talking seconds. 2 or 3 minutes is a lifetime
Mm.
in sort of today's world. And they did that all through the messaging app.
Yeah.
The messaging app on the handsets, on the customer's handsets. I think it's, being able to create those experiences through the messaging app, I think is something we're seeing lots and lots of success.
And why do you think that is? Do you think that's just because of the nature of the handset itself, because we're so familiar with it? I mean, there was one of the stats that you mentioned before around, I mean, no one has one of these conversations via email. I mean, you don't
Mhm.
arrange to meet your friends in a restaurant via email. I mean, we used to, but it was 15 years ago, right? But these days, no one does it, even though you could do it on your handset on email. Everyone does it using messaging, really. I mean, is there something innate about it? Is it the immediacy of it? I mean, what creates it so much more compelling?
Yeah, well,
What do you think?
I think when it comes to business communication, starting your emails with a "do not reply," I don't
Yeah,
think necessarily helps.
yeah,
Doesn't necessarily help with a, sort of encouraging a dialogue with your customers. But I think in terms of why, I think it goes back to what I was saying previously. I think it's to do with how you would normally interact with your friends and family. I
mm,
think that's where it has huge impact. And businesses who get that right in creating an experience that feels similar to the way that you might engage and have a two-way conversation with your friends and family. That's why I think it has such impact. And I think the sooner that organisations, and I believe there's a bit of a superiority complex that the
mm,
marketing world, especially sort of high-tech marketing agencies that believe that the messaging app is a bit lowbrow, it's a bit basic.
mm,
Um, but I think they're overlooking, especially with recent developments, they're overlooking a channel there that can be the destination of content. Doesn't necessarily have to have an SMS with a link in it that takes you somewhere else to an application that you've spent 500,000 on, or to a website that's extremely expensive. You can delight and engage customers directly in the messaging app.
so what do you think's happened with attention? Going back to the attention economy, which I think is a really interesting concept, and I hadn't come across it, and it caused me to go down a rabbit hole of attention economics, which there is as well. So, I mean, what do you think sort of behind it, and what do you think the longer term trend is on attention?
Well, I think it isn't a universal bad thing, the attention
Mm,
economy. I think it is painted as we're brainwashing children, brainwashing ourselves not to
mm,
be able to keep attention for a certain amount of time. And I think there's a lot to that. I only have to look at my number of hours I'm on my mobile phone each day and
yeah,
be a little bit ashamed because because it's
that's 4, 5.
over a certain amount,
Yeah,
and I'm thinking all I've been
yeah,
doing is scrolling BBC Sport and Twitter
yeah.
probably for most of that time. Um, but on the other hand, I think the attention span, I think it is trying to raise the game. I think it raises everybody's game. It raises the game
Mm,
of organizations in being able to create amazing customer experiences. And I think it doesn't
yeah.
matter what industry that you're in, you should be aiming to deliver amazing customer experiences. And I think that's my what gets me out of bed every morning.
And
I
what?
think to a certain
Yeah.
degree.
Yeah, and what I quite like about the fields is they sort of like the academics sort of like peel it away into like what are the key levers. So like
Mm,
how do you create engaging content, and how do you sort of keep stuff, in one location, like the short video. What is it that's successful versus not, which I suppose comes back to some of the piece around sort of having embedded content. I mean, having things on the phone where you don't have to go to a third party is kind of seems like that's
mm.
important.
Yeah, and I think another really important part of how creating engaging content, creating
Mm,
engaging customer experiences around the impact that could have on certain industries. And I think about
mm,
the collections industry, for example, who do an amazing job supporting vulnerable customers, supporting people
mm,
who require help. And I think there's lots
mm,
of research out there in terms of the developing customer experience that ensures that you are giving that vulnerable person the best possible chance of confronting the situation that they're in and actually seeking
Mm,
help. And I think by having a bad customer experience, by having something that isn't easy to deal with, you are more likely to turn off that vulnerable customer to actually seeking help. And
mm,
so therefore, that's what I mean about this. It isn't a universal bad thing that we're having to raise our games to engage with consumers, because the outcome for certain industries is extremely beneficial. If you can create something that gives trust, that is easy to do business with, that then allows a vulnerable customer to seek the help that they need,
mm.
I think that's quite a good outcome to the arms races, as you said.
I mean, one of the reasons why we were chatting was because, I do think with the cost of living crisis that's coming up, I mean, like trying to get hold of people and get people to say, breaking down stigmas that there might be around collections or around getting help, trying to get their attention to say, well, actually, this isn't maybe quite as scary as you think, and we are here to help is kind of paramount, right? And you
Mm,
can sort of, and can you use some of these techniques to sort of get in front of people that maybe wouldn't have done before, and maybe some of the thinking behind attention economy allows you to almost like break that down. What are the levers we need to look at? So, engaging content, speed, making it easy to do business with, having a high open rate, making sure there's a
mm.
long stick rate in terms of actually being able to look through it. So like the time to next, the time to scroll almost, and can you use the levers to try and generate communications that generates that engagement, right?
Absolutely. And remembering that it's highly likely the people I've spoken to over the past 3 or 4 months in the financial services industry have all confirmed that although they haven't really seen the huge increase in contact related to the cost
Mm,
of living crisis, with a bit of a it has a bit of a warmer autumn,
mm,
and therefore the real impact of the cost of living crisis has not really yet been felt. However, what they have found is that they are dealing with households and people within those households that have never experienced the collections industry before.
mm,
And so, how on earth are they going to navigate a particular world that they've never experienced before? This is the first time in their lives that they've actually entered
mm,
this particular phase of managing their debt.
mm.
Um, and I think they're only going to be helped if those organisations are creating, leading customer experiences that ensures that they do seek the help that they need
Yeah.
and they are aware of the help that is available to them.
I mean, certainly WhatsApp seems like, that's sort of taken us forward in terms of like, extra rich sort of kind of content that's coming up. I mean, is that what the other guys are sort of like building on that too? I mean, where do you sort of see us going from, essentially a lot of us are still sending SMS at the moment, but
Mm.
where do you sort of see us going from here?
I think WhatsApp's a really interesting channel in that
Mm,
it gives the ubiquity across both iOS and
mm,
Android handsets.
mm,
Um, I think there's still some way to go with the rich media, the rich imagery that
mm,
WhatsApp can deliver, and also maybe some of the interactive experiences. For example, Google have created a particular piece of technology called Rich Business Messages, which
mm,
allows you to have things like suggested replies. So,
mm,
the customer friction that's solved in that. Would you like to do A, B, and C? On WhatsApp, you'll have to type out A, B, or
mm.
C. Whereas with Google Business Messages, you're
You
actually
press the
able
button,
to
can you?
just press a button, and therefore the
Yeah.
customer friction is lower. Now, whether Meta and WhatsApp will up their game and improve that is highly likely, I
Mm,
would say, considering that they are looking to make that um, the best channel it can be. But I think having more interactive app-like experiences within the messaging application itself, that's the way I see messaging going sort of more long term. And when you add in the ability to create conversational AI experiences, which essentially means just mimicking a two-way conversation between a business and an organization, but you've got artificial intelligence that is running those interactions. When you add those two things together, rich imagery, rich conversations plus conversational AI, I think that's is a major theme that I see developing in 2023.
yeah. I mean, we spend so much time on on our messaging apps. I mean, just personally, don't we? I mean, do you see the messaging apps almost like evolving to become almost like a replacement for the web browser in some ways? So I know we're not quite there yet, but it could in some ways, rather than being sort of portals where you sort of click and point and click, I mean, it becomes information that scrolls, but it's the same information. Do you see us evolving to that as it's almost like, instead of being Internet Explorer, it's now the messaging app that kind of replaces it. Um,
It, it's
it's an interesting
it
trend, I think.
is a trend for sure. I think, for example, Google have developed a chat-based um, solution which is available if you were to search or in just your standard browser-based search that you might have on your phone, um, or if you were in Google Maps.
Hmm.
Now, interestingly, if I want to find the opening time of something, I've noticed this myself. I tend to go to Maps. I
Hmm.
tend to go to Maps. I find the place I'm going to try and find out what time it opens, and there it is. Now, what Google have done is created a chat-based feature that allows you then to potentially have a chat between the particular business, the really local business, and yourself.
Hmm.
And so, yeah, I suspect, as you say, what the trend that the sort of the large um, sort of tech players like Meta and Google want to do is to spend more and more time in their universe than outside.
Yeah. I mean, what's the difference between a search bar and your chat bar if you're talking with someone? So
Mm,
you could be chatting with someone and you just type it into your chat bar, and then they just give you the answer back, be it one of these automated assistants, and then it just comes back with the information, maybe in a little bit more of a message-friendly format. But that be engaging because it'll give you a notification, and then it gives you license to then go back and then have more of a two-way dialogue with the business, as an example.
well, the real extension. I remember when Google launched our rich business messaging back in 2018 in the UK, and the hyperbole that tends to come with Google
Hmm.
launches is that they believed that this has the potential of wiping out 95% of all apps on phones
Yeah.
because you won't need to go. Banking is a great example of that. Why go into it if the security is there, and they're happy that you're speaking to the right person and all that very, 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 very important stuff around security? Why open an app to go and find out what your balance is
Hmm.
when you might be able to go into a messaging conversation with, Barclays? What's my balance? Type
Hmm.
out what's my balance, and you just get that back straight away. Why
Hmm.
bother going into an app to do that? So I think when you really think about some of the interactions that you might do with some of
Yeah.
these sorts of organizations, you might find that the trend could be that they could be automated all within the messaging
Yeah.
application.
I mean, security would have to be there, but I suppose it's just interesting in terms of like how do we have to think differently around customer journeys in almost like we did think of everything almost like in this static sort of web page portal type format
Mm,
before, and
mm,
even now we think of that in terms of like, well, I'm going to go to this page, I need to go to this page, um, and it just sort of changes it into almost like a stream of consciousness on messaging, doesn't it? Where you sort of like, well, what is the journey and how do I then sort of go throughout that journey to reach my endpoint?
yeah.
It's an interesting, it's a different way of thinking of almost like the experience to a certain extent. It's more like a
Mm.
conversation in a conversational manner.
And time becomes an interesting
Hmm.
uh, variable within that.
Hmm.
So no longer do you have to think about customer journey from it being synchronous
Hmm.
perspective. So your customer journey could last for 7 hours.
Hmm.
Is as especially on a messaging channel, as somebody goes to work, they might send a message to try and ask a particular query. You would then answer. They would pick it up during their break. They would then potentially answer again in lunch. They would then complete the transaction on the way home,
Hmm.
or transaction or interaction. So time becomes a particular vary. Can you create asynchronous customer experiences as well as synchronous customer experiences? And that becomes a whole different way of managing customer interaction.
And how do we best manage the multiplicity of channels and the pros and the cons of each of them? Because the customers are going to prefer one or the other depending on the demographic, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think consumers always go for the path of least resistance.
Hmm.
And I think there, from a customer experience perspective, from the availability of channels, and I think it's up to brands to ensure that they're listening to customers
Hmm.
and understanding that a shift in trends, a shift in the type of interactions, almost what channel is the best channel for that type of use case.
Yeah.
So we're talking a lot to our customers about optimization. Um, how do you optimize for a particular reason? If you're optimizing for marketing, if you're optimizing for engagement, you might have quite an inexpensive campaign because you're going to send it to the most number of people so you can get the reach as high as possible. But you want to ensure that you've got the engaging content.
Mm.
However, if you are optimizing for delivery, you're optimizing for the customer must receive that interaction. You
Mm.
might choose a more expensive channel instead.
Yeah.
And so there's a really interesting play where you've got to understand the use case that you're designing the customer experience around, and then optimize to what is most important for for the customer.
And what about information that comes back as well? So that they have different levels of information that comes back. I mean, so if you're sending, I imagine much more sort of like basic SMS campaign, it might be different than if you're sending, a more complicated, almost like rich messaging type campaign that comes back in terms of how the information comes back, how you can then use that to then decide what the best journey is. I mean, does that vary? And then you also have barriers, I suppose. So, for example, WhatsApp Business Chat, you have to get approval to be able to send the
Mm.
messages. I mean, how should we start thinking about that in terms of as we sort of lay it out? Because I think everyone's kind of just defaulted to SMS because everyone has a mobile phone, everyone has an SMS, and you know it's going to get there,
Mm.
and it makes it easy, right?
Yeah, you're 100% right. Creating and sending an SMS campaign is really quite straightforward.
Yeah.
Um, uh, as as you probably know yourself with receiving messages, you can choose to actually have a message being sent with your brand name in the subject line, almost like for
Mm.
an SMS in the who is this from? It's from Tesco, for example.
Mm.
But that doesn't necessarily facilitate the reply functionality. So if you're sending a broadcast message, it's from Tesco. Here's your Tesco club card voucher, whatever. You will get how many messages were delivered, and if you've included a link in there, if you've got link tracking, you could see how many people clicked the link.
Yeah.
Whereas something much more sophisticated, such as a conversational marketing experience, you could get all manner of different KPIs.
Yeah.
And this is what I mean about optimization. It all depends on what you're optimizing for. And I
Mm.
think if you're optimizing for conversion rate, that is where some of the more sophisticated KPIs, some sophisticated analytics will actually be much, much more powerful.
Mm.
And as I said, you can then begin to measure engagement in time.
Yeah.
I think a brand new 2023 2024 KPI that is going to rank alongside click-through rate, open rates, bounce rates that you've got with emails, and delivery rate for SMS, I think is going to be attention rate.
Mm.
How can I measure my campaign with how much attention that I managed to get from my customers or prospects with this campaign?
Yeah. So in a collections environment, it might be, how much engagement do you have? How much attention do I have? How far down the journey do they go before they go somewhere else? And do they stay engaged as well versus just leaving it?
Mm,
I mean, all of those would be valid questions, I would think.
yes, absolutely.
It's very interesting, and I suppose particularly in the context of the current environment in terms of like engagement with pre-arrears, I do kind of things. But I mean, where do you think we sort of go from here? I mean, you're obviously talking with financial services providers, you're talking with marketing. I mean, where do you think sort of like what does the new year look like in terms of where we go from here in terms of the messaging space?
I think I personally believe in the conversations that I've had so far
Mm.
this year. There are some that believe that going through COVID, going through maybe even as far back as the financial crisis of 2008, leaves
Mm.
those organisations in a good place
Mm.
to manage the demand that is going to come next year. Um, but I think there's also organisations which I personally agree with in that they're looking at ways they believe that they're not ready and that they don't really comprehend what kind of demand is
Mm.
going to be coming their way in 2023, and therefore are looking at ways of those marginal gains now. And I think those organisations that are innovating, especially around the sort of the non-revenue generating interactions. So it could be cancellation process, it could be
Mm.
refunds, it could be a failed direct debit. In the collection space, of course, it could be um, the likelihood in pre-arrears they're showing the proclivity to be going into arrears. What
Mm.
type of customer journey can you create that is going to manage that peak demand? And
Mm.
and I believe that peak demand is going to be of a nature where there's going to have to be some thinking around automated communication, that doesn't need an agent, a very valuable agent, completely clogged up with non-value adding interactions that could be satisfied through, sort of really straightforward conversational AI solutions. And that's exactly the type of conversation that we're having at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly what it opened my eyes to was it's not just the channel which you use to try and get hold of people. It's also this whole new world that's out there in terms of what you can say to then try and get the engagement
Mm,
as well. So it's
mm,
kind of like because you need both of them as well. So it's not just like do they actually read it? It's also like then how do you get the engagement? And it's what you say and the capability you've got in terms of like what you can say to actually get them engaged. And there's this sort of this world that seems like it's kind of opening up in terms of doing that sort of relatively cost effectively to get people to have more attention than maybe they had using some of the older
mm.
methods. And it
Absolutely.
seems like it's an area that's developing really. Well, James, it's a fascinating area. I mean, I know we've talked quite a bit already, and I think I could talk longer. But I wanted to thank you very much for spending the time today, and it's been great. It's really interesting.
It's been a real pleasure, Chris. Thank you for having me on.